What had fascinated me was the fact that in one of his poems, Bobby Sands had said, you know, where are the artists? Where are the poets who are meant to uphold in society or culture some defence of the oppressed? They're supposed to act as a conscience, they're supposed to act as observers, and yet where were they when these people were held in these horrific circumstances? So that always held a particular fascination for me. And so as secretary of the Bobby Sands Trust, I proposed 2 years ago that for the 25th anniversary we ask poets, artists, filmmakers, playwrights, a whole variety of people, but not necessarily Republican activists, because their testimony has been published elsewhere and is ongoing. And so I wrote off to a number of poets. Some people, like for example the musician Christy Moore and Robert Balla, the artist, were quite consistent. Like before the hunger strike, they were there as activists, writing about the issue. Like 90 Miles from Dublin Town by Christy Moore, about the situation in the H blocks, was written in 1979 or 1980, before any hunger strike. Robert Balla, whose amazing drawing and prophetic drawing, as it turned out, of a blanket man wrapped in a shroud lying on a slab, is so reminiscent and prophetic of the death of the hunger strikers. He had actually drawn that in 1979, 1980 for the cover of another book called On the Blanket by Tim Pat Coogan. But it was so powerful an image that we wanted to use it. So I mean, those were two people who had been consistent and whose writings and testimony are published in the book. And then there's a variety of others whom we approached, like Ed O'Brien, famous Irish writer, John Montague, famous Irish poet, and people who had been involved in activism, like Tony Benn, Ken Loach, who recently made The Wind That Shakes the Barley. All of those people contributed. And the introduction to the book has actually caused a bit of a controversy. There's been an exchange of letters in the Irish Times because it's been inferred that I have criticised Seamus Heaney because he made no response to the hunger strike, whereas I quote an Irish critic, Dennis Donoghue, saying that nationalism is a fine flower and you get all these people to write about it, provided it's in Lithuania or Poland. In fact, what he was doing was he was criticising those people who have a hypocritical attitude, or who actually should admit that they were afraid to raise their heads above the parapet because of Section 31, because their publicist told them it would do them damage. But these people in the H blocks in the Armagh prison went through hell. And if it was happening in Lithuania or Israel or Poland, then a lot of our poets and writers would have been out there signing petitions and putting petitions and advertisements in the Irish Times and other papers demanding that they be treated with human rights and dignity. And that's all that the prisoners were demanding.
The first arrival in the H blocks was almost surreal. It was an oppressive place. It was a place of aggression from the administration, verbal and physical abuse. We were stripped of our clothes, a number of us who arrived together, and we were taken into a cell and beaten. As time went on, it became clear that brutality was the norm. It was systematic. It was carried out by the prison administration, and no doubt with the permission of the authorities in the prison and in the NIO and at the highest level within the British government. The British felt that the prisoners were the soft underbelly of the freedom struggle out here. And they felt that if they could break the prison struggle, then they would also be able to defeat the Irish Republican Army on the outside.
In actual fact, what's distinct about the book is the variety of responses to the hunger strike and how each person, be it for example the person who signs himself as the angel, Father Brendan McFarlane, who was involved in meeting a contact of the British government in Aldergrove Airport very late one December night when a document was handed over which was meant to be the basis for ending the first hunger strike, and that's the document that the British government reneged on. His account of visiting Bobby Sands, Brenton Hughes, his account of trying to broker a deal. It's quite fascinating. Mary Doyle, who was a woman hunger striker in 1980, how she felt unable to go on hunger strike again in 1981 when her mother had been killed by loyalists whenever she was in jail in the 1970s. There is a fascinating account by a young lad who was 16 in 1981, Pedram Malamian, who was an Iranian student in Tehran, and he and his friends, when Bobby Sands died, said, look, we're going to have to respond to this. This is in Iran, halfway across the world. And they decided to change Winston Churchill Avenue, which was the name where the British Embassy was in Tehran, to Bobby Sands Street. And so they changed the name, and next thing you know, taxis were being hailed in the street, oh, I'm going to Bobby Sands Street. And the British government, in response to that, sealed up the door and knocked a hole in the wall into another street, rather than have mail coming to British Embassy, Bobby Sands Street, Tehran. And of course, recently we discovered that Foreign Minister Jack Straw had secretly been making approaches to Iran to rename the street and to drop. These are people who tell us to draw a line through the past. Total hypocrites. So there's little angles like that. There's a story by a journalist called Paddy Prendeville, who is out in Malaysia, and these 2 or 3 guerrillas are facing death, the firing squad, and one of them hears his accent, and he turns around and says, well, are you from Ireland? He says, oh, what about Bobby Sands? So I mean, this thing that the name Bobby Sands has become, and Bobby Sands, I mean, the 9 other hunger strikers, although I tend to be overshadowed by Bobby's name, but that's for particular reasons. Bobby was the first one to die. He was an MP when he died. He also left a lot of writings behind him. But Bobby Sands as an icon is up there with Che Guevara internationally. People remember the name Bobby Sands. Remember in South Africa, for example, when Nelson Mandela and those prisoners on Robben Island were going on hunger strike, the code word for hunger strike was Sands. So yeah, all these different angles are mentioned in the book, from people in America, people in Australia, a French journalist coming over here, his impressions, member of the Troops Out movement, as I said, a variety of poets. Francie Brawley, the man who wrote the H-Block song, tells what motivated him. Terry George, who made the film Some Mother's Son, relates how he was motivated to make that film. So it's very, very rich. There is a variety of responses, including, for example, Eugene McCabe, well-known Irish author who's also a pacifist. Bill Brown, member of the Ulster-Unionists and Orange Order, who writes about how the Protestant community felt about the hunger strike. So there's a variety, 50 contributors in all, and I think that's what makes it a fairly powerful and unique book.
It can be invidious naming some names and not others, because the truth of it is, all of these contributors in this book have come up with a kernel of truth, a revelation or an insight unique and very instructive and moving, as if the enormity of the hunger strikes had overpowered the usual ploys of ego. There is a genre of literature dealing with books written by prisoners or ex-prisoners. John Mitchell, Michael David, Jean Genet, Brendan Behan, for instance, to name but 4. This book is unique in that practically all the writers here write about events going on inside prison from a point of view outside it. Man is a political animal, and our private lives are affected by public events. Anne Cadwallader has a fine piece about how an English woman becomes politicised by events in Ireland. Likewise, Mary Pearson, who was secretary of the Troops Out movement in Birmingham, she mentions Bobby Sands got 10,000 more votes than Mrs. Thatcher. She's especially good on the personal physical attacks, the vilification and threats for being involved with a cause so unfashionable and dangerous. Mary Nellis was an ordinary mother, not that there is such a thing, who became involved through her sons being imprisoned. Here is a piece of writing honest and true. The incident trying to smuggle tobacco and a piece of Turkish delight into prison at Christmas is both moving and amusing. She had to sacrifice the tobacco. The Turkish delight was secreted in the same place from which we all made it into this world. When she finally got the Turkish delight to her son, he looked at it and remarked, "It seemed to have changed shape since he was last on the outside." No writer of fiction or filmmaker could invent a detail like that.